In 1961, a man in a lab coat asked ordinary people to hurt a stranger. Most of them did it, not because they were cruel, not because they were broken, because a man in a lab coat told them to. This is the Milgram Obedience Experiment, and for 60 years, the story we've been told about it is only half true. Here's how it worked. A volunteer walks into a room at Yale University. They're told they're part of a study on memory and learning. There's another volunteer in the next room, strapped to a chair, wired to electrodes. The real volunteer's job is simple. Read a list of word pairs, and every time the man in the next room gets one wrong, deliver an electric shock. Each wrong answer, the voltage climbs. 15 volts, 75, 150, all the way up to 450, a label on the switch reading simply, "Danger, severe shock." The man in the next room was an actor. There were no real shocks. But the volunteer didn't know that. As the voltage climbed, the actor began to protest. He banged on the wall. He complained about his heart. Eventually, he went silent, and the room stayed silent, which was somehow worse. And the whole time, a researcher in a lab coat stood beside the volunteer, calm and unbothered, saying only 4 phrases, on repeat. Please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue. You have no other choice. You must go on. Stanley Milgram had predicted almost no one would go all the way to 450 volts. He'd asked psychiatrists to guess beforehand, and they estimated maybe 1 in 1,000 would do it. Some kind of sadist, an outlier. Instead, roughly 2 out of every 3 volunteers went all the way to the end. Not psychopaths, not soldiers. Teachers, clerks, engineers, ordinary people, pulled off the street. And that's the version of the story you've probably heard. Ordinary people will do monstrous things if an authority figure tells them to. It became one of the most cited findings in the history of psychology. It got taught in classrooms to explain the Holocaust. It got used to explain war crimes, corporate fraud, every atrocity where someone later said, "I was just following orders." Except that explanation has a problem hiding inside Milgram's own data, and almost nobody talks about it. Milgram didn't run this experiment once. He ran it more than 20 times, changing small details each time, and the obedience rate did not stay anywhere near 2/3. It swung wildly from nearly 65% down to under 10%, depending on one thing, how close the volunteer felt to the person they thought they were hurting. When the learner was in a different room and silent, obedience was highest. When his voice could be heard protesting through the wall, it dropped. When he was in the same room as the volunteer, it dropped further. And when the volunteer had to physically hold the man's hand down onto a shock plate themselves, obedience collapsed to about 30%. That's not a story about blind obedience. That's a story about distance. The less real the suffering felt, the easier it was to keep going. There's a second detail almost nobody quotes, buried in Milgram's own recordings and later found by researchers who went back through his archived audio decades later. The volunteers weren't calm. They weren't detached. Many of them were in visible distress, sweating, stammering, laughing nervously, begging the experimenter to stop the study, to go check on the man themselves. Some refused outright and were talked back into continuing. This wasn't obedience flowing smoothly. It was people being pressured inch by inch past a line they clearly did not want to cross. And here's the part that flips the whole story again. In 2012, a French psychologist named Laurent Beg attempted to trace exactly how much the wording of the experimenter's prompts mattered. Later analyses of Milgram's own condition data found something striking. When the volunteer was told simply to continue, without being told they had no other choice, obedience dropped sharply. The moment participants believed they still had a choice, many of them stopped. It wasn't blind faith in authority, It was the belief that they weren't allowed to say no. So who actually kept going to 450 volts, and who refused? Later analysis of Milgram's data found something almost nobody mentions. The volunteers who obeyed fully weren't simply more submissive people. Many showed real moral conflict throughout, and many later said they only continued because they trusted the institution running the study. This was Yale. Surely, they reasoned, a place like this wouldn't actually let someone get hurt. That trust was the lever, not cruelty, not weakness. A basic human faith that legitimate authority wouldn't ask them to do something truly wrong. Which means the real question was never, how far will people go when ordered to hurt someone? It's closer to, how far will people go when they've been taught their whole lives that institutions in white coats and government buildings know something they don't and deserve the benefit of the doubt. That's a far more uncomfortable finding than humans are secretly monsters. It means most of us aren't dangerous because we're cruel. We're dangerous because we're trusting, because distance makes suffering abstract, because we've been trained to believe someone else is holding responsibility so we don't have to. Milgram himself wrote that the most fundamental lesson of his study wasn't about evil at all. It was that ordinary people, simply doing their jobs, without any hostility on their part, can become agents in a terrible process. Not monsters, not sadists, people who kept telling themselves someone else was in charge. So the next time you hear someone say they were just following orders, maybe the question isn't whether they're a good person or a bad one. Maybe it's how much distance they'd been given from what they were actually doing, and how many times they were told, gently, they had no other choice. Most of us like to believe we'd have been the 1 in 3 who refused. The uncomfortable truth is that belief is usually untested, and the institutions asking for our obedience today are just as good at making us feel like we have no other choice.